you. Maybe they're not. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's presentation. It's the third in a series of three, hosted by Waterford Council of Trade Unions as part of the Decade of Centenaries programme under the general theme of Waterford Workers and the Struggle for Independence. The event is sponsored by Waterford City and County Council, and we're very grateful to them for their support. We're fortunate to have Dr. Kieran Allen to speak to us this afternoon on the theme of workers' struggles in the local area and in the context of the national situation at the time. He's a published author on the period and in the labour movement, and his books include 1916, Ireland's Revolutionary Tradition, and the Politics of James Connolly, amongst others. He's a senior lecturer in UCD and a prolific writer, and we're delighted to have him here to talk to us this afternoon. Please welcome Dr. Kieran Allen.
Okay, first of all, thanks for that, and thanks for the invitation from the Waterford Council of Trade Unions. So you can see the title I've got there, Was There an Irish Revolution? Which you might think is a bit superfluous these days, because people do mention the word revolution quite a lot. On this centenary, the anniversary, the term revolution has been used much more now than it was, let's say, 20 years ago. Certainly when I was at school, I never heard there was an idea of an Irish Revolution. I heard there was a war of independence. And if you look at, for example, histories of people like John A. Murphy, if you look at his book, Ireland in the 20th Century, which was quite a popular historical book in the 60s, 70s, there's not a mention of revolution. It's simply what Michael Collins, De Valera, and all the sort of social struggles that Pat was talking about were effectively ignored from the book. And that then, if you like, there was a very traditional nationalist interpretation of Irish history, which talked about it mainly as a military struggle to get rid of the British Empire. And then you really, in the period of the, what's called the Northern Troubles, you had really a revisionist argument about Irish history. So I'm just giving you an example here. Peter Hart, since deceased, I'm afraid, who really said there was no Irish Revolution. There was really sort of commotion and strife, and he really defines it really as communal violence that resulted in the displacement of minority populations, particularly the Protestant population. Now, I think that's nonsense, because I think that while there was isolated incidences, if you look at even from a military point of view, most of the actions of the IRA were targeted at state forces rather than at Protestants or attempts to drive anybody out. So that was one attempt by the revisionist school. Some of you may remember Brian Farrell, I think from the age profile here you might, from, was it 7 Days, I think was a programme. And his notion was, well, there was no Irish Revolution because when you look at the politics of the people who led it, so let's say Arthur Griffith or Michael Collins for that matter, he's basically saying that they had really imbibed the British political culture of constitutionalism. So why would you be talking about a revolution when you just think of the figure De Valera, Collins, Arthur Griffith? They wouldn't have taken on board that. And the last example I want to give of questioning this idea of revolution is of a former colleague of mine at UCD, Tom Garvin, who wrote the book 1922. And he uses a term from the there was a very strong Marxist tradition in describing the French Revolution as a revolution against feudalism. But there emerged in the 80s this term dérapage, which means it kind of something skidded off course. So Garvin's overall argument was, listen, we had a very good British constitutional tradition in Ireland, which was about parliamentary democracy, and then there was this kind of skidding off course that went on for a year or two, but we all came back to our senses at the end of the Civil War because, you know, the Cumann na Gael government managed to impose order and get rid of all this nonsensical talk about violence and revolution. So this whole school, which by the way dominated a lot of the universities and is only now beginning to change, really dismissed the idea of an Irish Revolution. And even though we use the term revolution quite a bit nowadays, it's still worth exploring what do we mean exactly to say there was an Irish Revolution. So let me start then by some basic ideas. What do we mean when we say there's a revolution taking place? And I think the first characteristic of revolution, pretty obviously, is that existing elites are unable to hold their grip on society. I mean, most of the time, think about our present state at the moment, I think we do have an elite. Most of the time, there's all sorts of bit of rows going on about Simon Coveney at the moment, but generally speaking, the elite have a good grip on where society is going. And the main way they do that is that they often connect. The elite are a very small number of people, but they connect with an intermediary strata, usually the professional classes that, if you like, share their worldview, communicate their worldview, whether they're the teachers, the lawyers, the auctioneers, they do all this. So the first element of revolution is where this link breaks down, and therefore the elite begin to lose their grip on society. Now, in the case of Ireland from the end of the 19th century to certainly by the 1916 rising, is really an oasis of stability. The Irish Parliamentary Party of John Redmond, we've heard quite a lot about, ran the show here completely, no opposition to them. It looked like the land issue had been sorted to some extent with the buying out of land, but then this completely unravels with the great imperial conflict of 1914, the concessions that Redmond makes in terms of partition. If you like, this link, this grip that the Irish Parliamentary Party has, and through them links to the British Liberal Party, it begins to break down. So the first element of revolution is how the elite begin to lose their grip on society. The second element of any revolution is when the mass of people who often, watch politics as spectators, begin to take direct action themselves. Strike action, setting up of assemblies. Think of the most recent Egyptian revolution, people sitting on the streets, beginning to get rid of the Mubarak dictatorship through direct action. So this is a feature of revolution. And with that goes an enormous politicisation. People, especially in Ireland, are political in the sense they follow politics, and people follow it quite actively, but there's not a great passion for politics sometimes. But in a revolution, the passion and the interest in politics increases to an immense degree. The other feature of revolution I just want to mention is that people think of revolutions as an event. There is on this particular day, there was a revolution. Not really. When you look at patterns of revolution, there tends to be a long process, often of a number of years. People do not go into revolution looking for extreme demands, generally speaking. Think of the Russian Revolution. They want land, bread and peace. Ireland just wanted to respect the fact that the Irish people had voted to have a separate republic. Pretty moderate basic demand. But often revolutions start with moderate demands, but in this process, the radicalisation begins to grow. And one thing I haven't mentioned in the slide, we'll come to afterwards, most revolutions also produce counter-revolutions. Because if you think about it, the elite have begun to lose their grip on society. They begin to think about ways we can get back our grip, and often they tend to resort to the most violent and often the most reactionary ideas in order to get their grip back on society. So, as an example, Italy in the 1920s, you have occupation of factories, peasants taking the lands. What do the landlords do? They get in touch with Mussolini, who forms his corps, beats back the people, and so on. So most revolutions produce a counter-revolutionary effect, which also affects the outcome of revolutions. So, if we make a comparison between Russia in 1917 and Ireland, you can see there are different outcomes of this process. So, very simply and schematically, the Russian Revolution starts off with a mass demonstration in February 1917, and then you have the formation of workers' councils, and then you have an insurrection, and then you have a civil war. In Ireland, the process is a little bit in reverse, a little bit mixed up, but nevertheless there is a process at play, which is we have failed insurrection in 1916, popular vote for independence in 1918, then a shift into armed struggle. As we'll see, it's not just an armed struggle, it is mass involvement by the population in this struggle, and then eventually, as I'm going to argue, the victory of a counter-revolution through the Civil War. So that the process is we still have a long process, but the outcome is actually quite different. But nevertheless, I think we can talk about an Irish Revolution. Now, in what sense then do the mass of people engage in direct action in this period between 1918 and 1923? And I really want to just go through, and some of this will I'm afraid, repeat the points that Pat has made in his excellent talk, and I'll be mainly focusing on what's happened on a national level, because I think this has been done quite comprehensively, what happened in Waterford. But I just want to really indicate really 4 elements to the Irish Revolution in terms of mass involvement. And the first is armed struggle, but combined with mass resistance. That there wasn't this idea, there was Michael Collins, led the IRA, very clever man, very good military tactician, part of the story, but the other part of the story, which is often neglected, is the role that the mass of the people played in inflicting a defeat on the British Empire. Secondly, usually most revolutions involve forms of dual power. And by dual power, I mean there is an attempt to set up alternative structures to the existing state. Now, as we'll see in Ireland, unlike the Soviet example, the attempts at dual power ultimately fail, which is an interesting aspect of the Irish Revolution. There is the organisation of the labour movement and its direct involvement, and then crucially, as was pointed out last time in the last session, there is a major upheaval on the land. Okay, so let's start with the first one then, the armed struggle. So again, just think of the scale of this. It is estimated that 100,000 people joined the Irish Volunteers, which are then renamed the IRA. 100,000 people is a huge amount of people. Now, of that 100,000, it is estimated that about 15,000 bore arms and took part in an armed struggle. So we're talking here, and the main reason for that, is the shortage of weaponry and the, effectively the shortage of weaponry, the main reason, and obviously there's personal difference in terms of bravery and so on, but the main reason was the actual shortage of weaponry. So we're talking not about a small guerrilla army, of a tight-knit structure, a cell structure. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, well, you have the figure here, in Tipperary, over 1,000 IRA people who see themselves as members of the IRA, who are committed to supporting the armed struggle. This is quite a big movement rather than your small guerrilla army that people often think of when they think of guerrilla armies today. You think, contrast, for example, the Cuban Revolution. And many people are involved in the armed struggle of Castro and Guevara, not of this proportions, much smaller. So a lot of people are involved in the armed struggle. Now, what was the main point of the armed struggle during the Irish Revolution? And this is the classic tactic of any anti-imperialist movement. It is to remove the outposts of the empire. And the main outposts of the empire were the RIC barracks and, to a lesser extent, the tax offices. So these were the focus of the, if you like, the military attempt to drive out the empire from Ireland. And here, it's important to say that and it was very successful, very, very successful. The reason why Britain has to import, about 7,000 black and tans and 6,000 auxiliaries is the RIC were effectively smashed by this type of mass military action, but also crucially, and this is what I want to emphasise, the boycott. I mean, the instruction from Sinn Féin, the motto of Sinn Féin was, no salutations, don't greet them, no social contact. If they attend, you leave. If they turn up in the church, you leave. If they turn up in the local bar, you leave. You ostracise them completely. So this is mass action involved in, you don't give them any food, you don't bring any messages to their barracks. The barracks is completely isolated. I was looking there at the, as Pat said, there were local elections in 1920. So in 1920, Sinn Féin take a lot of the council seats throughout the country. So you look at, for example, Westmeath. This is the Westmeath local authority. I think it was late in 1920. What did they do? We pass a resolution congratulating RIC members who resigned. They then sort of instruct they agree to pay the local IRA unit. We'll give them money to keep on their actions, and we will ask the directors of the local hospital not to serve any RIC people, not to have anything to do with them. They can go somewhere else. So what we have here is mass action, which is pushing out the empire and really shows the people taking involved in direct action. And what that did, I mean, to use a term from the Vietnamese conflict, it created liberated zones. Liberated zones were created across the country through this mass action. In the case of, like the example there of Mayo, half the RIC barracks gone, and that's even before, if you like, they begin to look at the prospects of bringing in the black and tans and so on. Okay, so the first point, therefore, is the Irish Revolution involves not your classic small guerrilla campaign, but involves a very big involvement of people in the IRA and support of mass action to liberate parts of the country from outposts of the empire. Now, what about the question of dual power? So you're trying to push out an empire, and what you need to do then, in any successful revolution, is you need to create institutions which are alternative institutions to the state that begin to organise society. This is a classic feature of any revolution. And the most successful element of this in Ireland was the creation of republican courts. And this is interesting because, first of all, this is a picture of the Cork Republican Court meeting in 1920, in some ways emulating the judge on the bench. But what was interesting is, number one, the judges were called the Brehons, going right back to the Brehon laws. But also, even more interesting, I mean, people that would actually be horrified at the idea now, the judges were sometimes elected. So people in a local chapel or parish area would come together and say, I'm proposing this person to be the judge, and that person is elected. There's not an assumption, that you come out of Trinity College or King's Inns or so on, you can be the judge. There is a much more egalitarian approach to law at the time. Now, having said that, any judge who resigned from the British court system automatically can, in some cases, become a judge of the Republican courts. Now, the Republican courts were hugely successful. And by that, what do we mean exactly? We mean that people boycotted the British courts, put pickets on the British courts, ostracised people who went to British courts, so that, if you like, the alternative structures are set up. And as the Irish Times lamented, they said, listen, the Sinn Féin tribunals, the Republican courts, are jostling British law into oblivion as fast as cars jostle pedestrians off the road. They were winning the issue in terms of the Republican struggle. So that aspect of dual power is extremely successful. But there was an other aspect of dual power which is much less successful, which was there was an attempt to argue that local councils should not be answerable to the British state, to the imperial state. Now, just some brief figures here. So the local elections take place in 1920, as we've said. And there are huge gains for Sinn Féin, like there were in 1918. And I made a mistake here. As a result, they get to control 27 of the 33 local authorities in the country. Sometimes in coalition with Labour, which, as I was saying to Pat earlier on, did far better across the country than it unfortunately did in Waterford at the time. Now, these councils, which are controlled by Sinn Féin, are then asked to move away from any loyalty to the empire and show concretely their loyalty to Dáil Éireann. And what they're asked to do is to collect the rates, which they would normally, local councils collect rates, but instead of sending these rates onto the British Exchequer, they were supposed to send these rates onto Dáil Éireann, which in turn would use this money to help finance the IRA campaign. It didn't work. Okay, this attempt to create a dual power structure did not actually work. And I mean, David Fitzpatrick is a historian. I don't necessarily agree with his overall analysis, but he makes a good point here. He says, well, why didn't it work? And the main reason it didn't work is that the wealthier elements in Irish society, those who would be mainly paying rates, they had no desire to risk their status by ensuring that the rates were going to be paid to some Republican who in turn was going to pay for the IRA. Wouldn't it be better to take the safer option of making sure that your rates went into the British Exchequer? So therefore, this idea that the local councils could be used, if you like, as an alternative structure to break away from the empire, that element of dual power did not work so well in Ireland. Now, the third element of the Irish Revolution I want to emphasise, and I think a lot of you may be familiar with it already, and Pat has covered some of it. I just want to cover the involvement of the labour movement as a movement in the fight for Irish independence, and as we'll see afterwards, how that spilled over into a class demands as well. And I'm just really going to, just as a potted history, just go over a few of the major events, some of which I say have been covered already, so a little bit of repetition here. Okay, so the first involvement of the labour movement in the Irish Revolution is the anti-conscription strike of 1918. And this comes out of a resolution of the Irish Trade Union Congress that we're going to have a general strike because the British government are attempting to conscript Irish people because enthusiasm for the war has declined. A lot of people have died in the war. They wanted to bring in conscription towards the end of the war, and this provokes a massive outrage, and it leads to a huge general strike, which, it has to be said, is also associated with support by the bishops, because the bishops also come out and say, listen, support the anti-conscription movement. So to some extent, it becomes associated with Catholicism, right? Just on that. And the reason why I say that is that, remember, in 1919 in Belfast, you have one of the biggest strikes in this country for the 44-hour week. Belfast is almost controlled by workers at the time, but it is pretty, it's not really involved in the 1920 conscription strike. Nevertheless, the anti-conscription strike is very successful. Britain is not able to carry through its demand for conscription, and as the conservative historian A.J.P. Taylor put it, he says this was the decisive moment that Ireland seceded from the Union. Because if you can't impose conscription, as you were on the rest of the empire, you're really on the way out in terms of imperial control. And here are some just pictures of it was an enormous movement. This, I think, is a picture in Balladreen of people protesting against conscription. And here is a mass rally, I think, held in Roscommon Town. Enormous support for the anti-conscription movement at the time. Okay, the second involvement of the labour movement in what's called the War of Independence, or the Irish Revolution, is the, often not so much mentioned in Irish history, is the strike of automobile drivers in 1919. And this is a strike where, the Model T car hadn't really spread here as much by the time, so driving a car often required almost a chauffeur or a professional driver. So these drivers were asked to get a permit from the British military, and immediately major strikes, again refusal to do that, occurred. And not altogether successful, but nevertheless we see here a picture of the drivers demanding that we're not going to accept British permits. Now the big one is really the Limerick Soviet. Now again, let's just focus on the second word there, Soviet. That's not an Irish word. We don't have the internet. Communications are pretty meagre at the time. Why are Irish people going around using the term Soviet? And obviously, it is the result of the influence of the Russian Revolution. And what you find in Limerick, And this is just, again, I haven't really factored this into it, but the influence of the Russian Revolution is quite extraordinary in Ireland. He's estimated that even before the Limerick Soviet is set up, 10,000 people gather in Limerick to celebrate the Russian Revolution, and hence the popularity of the term Soviet. So you have the gas Soviet in Waterford, and all the various Soviets around the country. Where does this come from? What triggers this one? And again, it is the attempt after a Republican prisoner had escaped by the British to try to impose military control over the city of Limerick by demanding that people have permits. And what you get then is the local trades council says, we're not having it, declare a general strike, rename themselves the Limerick Strike Committee. And this is why what the term Soviet simply means workers' council. And the difference between a general strike and a workers' council is that instead of, if you like, the negative action of withdrawing your labour, what a Soviet does is it begins to take control of the running of society. So the Soviet in Limerick begins to issue money, it begins to decide food rationing, who's getting access to this building and that building. So, if you like, workers are moving from simply, I'm going on strike, to I'm now beginning to take control of our city. I mean, this is what begins to happen in Limerick. Now, one point we should say, when we use the word Soviets, which is obviously the Russian word, is that the Soviets in Ireland, I mean, as Pat pointed out, they spring up all over the country. They're often not coordinated. They were in Russia. They also limit themselves to maybe one action. We want the end to the British permit. And often they don't involve the type of democratic structures that really characterise the Russian Soviets. In other words, that you elect somebody reports back. If they don't go and vote the way you want them to go, you can get rid of them. The word Soviet in Ireland is used much more loosely than that, but nevertheless, it shows the influence of the Russian Revolution. Less well known is the bacon embargo of 1920. This arose because there was regulation on the price of bacon and meat, was wartime regulations. These were removed. People were worried the price of meat would increase dramatically, and there was also memories of the famine. You know, the food is going out of Ireland, it'll go over to England and so on, and therefore the unions decided they were going to go on strike to insist that bacon not be exported from Ireland, and therefore leading to price rises. However, look at the ITUC statement and just think of the ICTU today and think of ITUC and spot the difference in terms of what's happening. So there we say, we do not recognise the right of the owners of bacon factories to withhold their premises and machinery from use at their discretion against the common interest. Can you imagine the ICTU saying something like that today? The material structures have been built and adapted by the workers for a social purpose to provide bacon for the people. If those who hold those things in trust fail to fulfil their trust, the people must relieve them of their trust. So, a very simple statement. You know, we have set up the structures by which bacon is produced. Owners have no right to decide. They can do what they like with it. And then the one that Pat mentioned is the general, really in many ways the high point of workers' involvement is a general strike to release the Republican prisoners in support of their hunger strike in 1920. Now, what's interesting about this is the reports around the country of, you have a general strike, a political strike, not just for economic demands. We demand the prisoners are released. But then look, Pat quoted one of them from the report of the atmosphere in Waterford. Let me just give you two examples here of the mood of workers in the country in the middle of this strike. So here's Galway. The Workers' Council is formed in Galway. The Soviet now translated to the Workers' Council, and is here to stay. God speed the day when such councils shall be established all over Erin and the world, control the natural resources of the country, the means of production and distribution, run them as the workers know how to run them, for the good and welfare of the whole community, and not for the profits of a few bloated parasites up Galway. Right? So you really, I mean, this is serious stuff. I mean, this is what really annoys me. All this has been written out of Irish history, and the detail of this, and detail of Pat's in Waterford. A lot of it's not aware. People often think the Irish are conservative, but just read this stuff, and you get a very different image of our history. Again, the Manchester Guardian, probably the same journalist that Pat quoted, was in Clonmel probably a day before, and here he is. It's particularly interesting to note the rise of workers' councils in country towns. We're talking about Clonmel here. The direction of affairs passed during the strike to these councils, which are formed not on a local but on a class basis. In most cases, the police abdicated and the maintenance of order was taken over by the workers' councils. In fact, this is Manchester Guardian. It is no exaggeration to trace a flavour of proletarian dictatorship about some aspects of the strike. And yeah, I'm sure you could repeat that for most towns in Ireland. I mean, I haven't seen the research, but I'm sure Clonmel or Galway were not particularly exceptional towns. Again, the one Pat mentioned is the other involvement was the strike of the railway workers, which he dealt with. But just to add, people refused to transport British munitions, British soldiers and so on. 1,500 workers were sacked by the authorities because of their refusal to do this. Now, the one I just want to spend a bit more time on is the land issue. Because remember, Ireland was very much an agricultural country at this particular point in time. And this is one that's really written out of the so-called War of Independence. And it's written out because people don't want to recognise that when people fight for national freedom, it's often not some airy-fairy romantic idea. It can also be interpreted by people as directly affecting their lives. So when I say, I want freedom from the empire, I don't just mean I want an Irish Parliament. It can also mean I want the end of the British landlord. I want to undo the land situation. I want to get rid of the big house. This is what people means. And this is what we refer to as a spilling over of national demands and social demands. And in terms of the land, there are really two types of struggles happening. One is the struggle of people who have land or want to take ownership of land. And this happens right across the country, and we find the burning of the big house, picture over there of one of the houses that are burnt, and it happens on a very consistent basis, particularly in the west of Ireland. So if we look at, for example, Galway, we find that there's, first of all, I forget that the landlord's name was killed. There's an actual killing of a landlord. Letters then go out to different landlords around the county saying, if you don't make a concession and divide up your land, we're coming for you as well. And there is a very serious attempt to take land off the graziers, as it was called, or the big landlords. So two examples here. In Headford, very small town in Galway, village in many ways, maybe town now. 200 or 300 people gather, march to Mr. Acorn's farm and say, give us the land. We're taking the land. And there's a threat implied as well if you don't give us the land. In Uach Gerard, again, hundreds march from the Ross estate in military formation up to the landlord's house, demand the redistribution of the land. And what are the tactics used? Burnings, a number of the big houses are burnt. Cattle drives, driving cattle off if you've got a big farm, drive the cattle off the big farm, and so on. Rent strikes, physical attacks. And it's very important to say there's I'll come back to how the Republican movement reacted to this in a minute, but it's very important to say the atmosphere here. Now, we'll come to this man after us, Kevin O'Sheil, who is effectively, he actually was one of the more conservative elements of the Republican courts, but he talks about Roscommon having an aggressive Bolshie spirit. In other words, they're about to take the land. There's no messing. They're not going to wait for any judgments. They're just going to take the land, which is what the Bolsheviks were up to in Russia. Now, again, Pat's mainly dealt with this. The other side of that, then, is the landless labourers, which I think has been dealt with in the previous session. And, I think you've mentioned the Battle of Fenor, the Harvard bonuses, the reduction in wages and so on. And, again, huge struggles in Waterford, as we've said, of landless labourers mainly, organised by the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. Now, seeing as this is your neighbouring county, I just want to quote the type of rhetoric that is used in this. Now, this is the watchword of Labour, effectively, is a Labour movement paper. And just look at this. I mean, this is incredible stuff. It says, the Red Commanders, that's what they're calling themselves, up on some farm in Carlow, had perfected their plan of campaign and the rank and file already. This was to be no mere stay-out holiday strike. The time has passed when battles were won by men on holidays. The experience of last year's land strikes has proved that the proletariat of the land are to win. If the proletariat of the land are to win against organised farmers, victory only comes through organised aggression, not passivity. Terrorism. What? Terrorism is the most potent of Labour's weapons, and while every other weaponry in our armoury must be used, it is the Red Terror that our greatest reliance must be placed. We're going to frighten the farmers and we're going to ensure that we get our way, was aspects of the Irish Revolution. Now, this is an extraordinarily serious situation in terms of the British Empire, and how does it respond? And very briefly, I think it responds really in three main ways. Number one, military repression. And, you know, when you see the Fine Gael minister somehow imagining that you could have a centenary for the RIC and the Black and Tans, you ask, what planet is this man living on? Because the level of military repression brought in by the British was pretty brutal. I mean, it included reprisal killings of Republican leaders, what we now call death squads. So, for example, in my native town of Galway, Griffith Road is named after Father Griffith, a Republican priest who's taken out, shot by a British death squad, as were two other Republican councillors in the town. Death squad, this is just death squad activity. If you think about the reprisals tactic, the burning of Balbriggan, not just Balbriggan, Miltown Malbay, Lahinch, Trim, a lot of towns, are sacked as a terror campaign to repress an anti-colonial resistance. So that's one. So the level of terror imposed to defeat the movement is pretty strong from the British. A second strategy of the British is to move very quickly to partition, to essentially assist the arming of loyalists, and to, as an act of revenge, to push through the Government of Ireland Act, set up an ordered state with all the consequences of that. But the last element, and there's an individual charged with it, a man called Andy Cope, who is charged with, and this is, the British they're pretty clever as a ruling class. They don't they've learned a lot over the years. As well as the repression, you don't just operate one tactic, you combine it with another tactic. And the second tactic is outreach to sections of the Republican leadership, which begins simultaneously with the repression that is being imposed on Ireland. Now, we'll come to what the effect of the outreach is afterwards. Let's go back then to what's the Republican response to this pretty complicated situation. And it's important to know here, really, what's, in my view, at the core of what becomes a very stunted revolution is the attitude of the Republican leadership, particularly to the land struggles. And I've just given you two examples. Well, first of all, we know from this is the Dáil appoints ministers as its attempt to set up a dual power situation, and the Minister for Agriculture, Arthur Connor, says very simply, he says the land seizures are a grave menace to the Republic. So this is something wrong, we want to stop them, and this is the official policy of the Republican movement at the time. The minds of the people was being diverted from the struggle for freedom by the class war. So the Republican leadership is very clear, this is something that has to be stopped. And then we have the testimony of Sean Moylan, later a Fianna Fáil TD, who was the IRA commander for Mayo. And this is one of the areas, by the way, where the IRA are much weaker. And he says afterwards, he says, I know what the IRA were doing in 2021. They were engaged in an unselfish, in other words, we don't want to sully it with any talk of land wars, unselfish struggle for the freedom of this country. I remember very well a discussion in IRA headquarters on the question of cleaning up the cattle drives. So this is the attempt of peasants to drive out the cattle, to redistribute the land. The IRA wanted to stop that in Mayo. Okay, so the Republican leadership does not want the struggle to spill over into a social struggle. Now, that is not to say that at ground level, certain IRA units are not sympathetic to it, but the official Republican position is that we want to keep this as a simple struggle for national independence and no talk about a social revolution. And really, in many ways, the key figure in this is Michael Collins. So, obviously, the film Michael Collins has created a certain legend about the individual, but it's important to say Michael Collins is a genius at organising a military campaign, but precisely because he sees it in military terms, he looks on it only in military terms, and his justification for eventually going into the truce and the treaty is essentially military justification. He says, we had on average 1 round of ammunition for each weapon we had. We're being encircled. We've no choice but to come through a concession, to compromise with the British. So what Collins leaves out and ignores completely, and in some ways has a disdain for, is these social struggles. He's not interested. No, he's not interested in any of this. It is purely military, and from a military point of view, we cannot sustain a purely military campaign. To some extent, he's correct. We cannot sustain a purely military campaign against the British Empire. However, one of the things I think that's been not so much focused on is how Sinn Féin itself begins to change in the course of this conflict. Now remember, Sinn Féin is a very small party before the 1916 rebellion. Arthur Griffith, he had a spurt of growth and then it begins to decline, certainly after his attitude to the lockout, but then it begins to grow very quickly again in the course of the Irish Revolution. But as it grows, and this happens in most nationalist movement, it begins to change its character. And probably one of the most perceptive writers on Sinn Féin, one of the participants is this man, P.S. O'Hegarty, even if we don't necessarily agree with his views. He says, what happened was that was not that Sinn Féin captured Ireland, but that the politicians in Ireland and those who make them all the elements which had sniffed at Sinn Féin and libelled it had realised Sinn Féin was going to win and had come over to it en masse. In other words, the wealthy and the professional classes, having dismissed these radical nationalists, in the course of the revolution, they begin to come into Sinn Féin. They begin to see it as their movement. And really, that's not just an accident, by the way. It comes back to Griffith's basic view. Remember, Griffith was not a radical. Griffith came out of South Africa, where he had quite racist attitudes to black people and eventually Jewish people. Crucially, he's very much opposed to trade unionism, and he wants to see Ireland turned into what he called a Gaelic Manchester. So, when the wealthier elements decide to join Sinn Féin, they can at least look to Arthur Griffith for support. Now, where was the left is the question that was raised in the last discussion. And this really, whichever way you want to put it, but I think that what's not contestable is there is a huge social struggle. You could say there's no leadership to it, or there's no political articulation of its demands, but there's certainly a missing link in the Irish Revolution. And why is that? Look at my heroes, James Connolly, but Connolly has a syndicalist. Connolly's belief was you build the union strong, you build a strong union. Connolly was not too interested in building a party, it's a complicated story, but let's leave that aside for a minute. But anyway, the point is that by the Irish Revolution, the one party in Ireland that is formed is the Socialist Party of Ireland. Okay, so the Irish Citizen Army essentially dissolves themselves into the Irish Volunteers. The remaining left expression is the Socialist Party of Ireland, but it's led by a man we came across in the last session, William O'Brien, who pulled the rug on the Waterford strike, and Tom Johnson, who probably is even more moderate than William O'Brien. And they initially as part of the mood of the population, expressed themselves in support of the Russian Revolution. So William O'Brien, you might be surprised to hear, I think the Russian Revolution was wonderful, I celebrate the Russian Revolution. But in their report to the Third International, the Communist International at the time, they say, what is the role that you have played in this revolution in Ireland? And they say, the preoccupation of the people with the struggle against British imperialism has been an obstacle of importance in preventing the spread of revolutionary socialism. In other words, they see the war against the empire as an obstacle rather than an opportunity. And they have an image of, insofar as they were being sincere, they have an image that somehow it's only when workers organise on strictly economic grounds rather than, in terms of fight against empire, that you have any chance of the left growing. Okay, the last point I want to make then is, so therefore, in many ways, what you have in Ireland is a revolutionary process, a long revolutionary process, even though there's no articulation of those who want to see a spillover from the national to the social revolution. But what emerges at the end of the Irish Revolution is a strong counter-revolutionary movement. And for me, we're through the centenary, the decade of centenaries as it's called. At present, I mean, you'll notice that how the Irish elite at the moment, having in the past banned 1916 celebrations, are now claiming that they are the peaceful inheritors of the 1916 rebellion. I want to argue, in fact, no, they're not. They are the peaceful inheritors of a counter-revolution that occurred in Ireland in 22-23. So let's look at how this occurred in terms of the treaty. And essentially the treaty, you have a truce, the treaty is signed at the end of 1921, and you've got two very different attitudes to it. The Catholic bishops said, and one of the bishops, I forget which one said, he said the men who made the treaty should be immortal. They go on to excommunicate anybody who opposes the treaty and demand that people accept the lawful government of those setting up the treaty. But then look at the attitude of James Larkin. I mean, okay, slightly overblown in his rhetoric, but he says, we propose to continue to fight for a land and air and fit for men and women, a workers' republic or death. In other words, we're rejecting the treaty, not just the Republicans, but there's also a rejection of the treaty from the point of view of the left, even in Larkin's case, if it's a bit rhetorical. Now, and this is when I was younger, you were never supposed to talk about the treaty. The Irish history books always ended before the treaty, but just some basic facts about the treaty. The treaty, the Civil War rather than the treaty. What the Civil War involved was essentially the British Empire supporting the Free State to crush their former Republican colleagues. And you can see the figures on this. I mean, the attack on the forecourts does not really start until Britain has supplied their former Republican opponents with the weaponry and indeed the money to pursue this civil war. And when we look at the actual figures, they're quite astounding. I mean, Britain supplies 15,000 guns to the Free State Army. This thing that's used to pound the forecourts, I think, has been supplied by Britain. But notice the private letter from Churchill to Michael Collins. Now again, remember Collins is the guerrilla leader, and this is Churchill writing to Collins, and he says, after the Battle of the Forecourts, which starts the Civil War, he says, if I refrain from congratulations, it is only because I do not want to embarrass you. So in other words, he's funded Collins, he's given the guns, he's encouraged them and so on. The archives of the forecourts may be scattered, but the title deeds of Ireland are safe. He's a good writer, Churchill. In other words, that a lot of destruction, but it's safe. You have made Ireland safe by attacking the forecourts. Now, within Sinn Féin, this is my main argument, there emerges what I call the Clongowes Woods boys, the people who've gone to private education, the professional classes, who begin to dominate Irish society and in many ways has shaped Irish society to this day. And the figure I think is most interesting to look at is Kevin O'Higgins, who was later, by the way, assassinated by Republicans because he was involved, the main figure involved in ordering the execution of 80 Republicans during the Civil War, some of whom were not involved in any activity. But just look at how Higgins conceives what's happening, or rather conceives his own role as he comes into taking state power after the Civil War. And he says the attitude of protest, the attitude of negation, the attitudes sometimes of sheer wantonness and waywardness and destructiveness, which has to a large extent been the traditional attitude of the Irish people, I'm going to stamp that out. And I'm going to stamp that out by bringing back the bailiff, by imposing order, and by, if you like, taking the measures which, as we saw in the case of Waterford, meant, for example, smashing of strikes. So the new elite of Kevin O'Higgins, Kevin O'Shiel, for example, another key figure, backroom figure in the Irish Parliament, they set about taking a number of measures which are about cracking down on this revolutionary wave and creating the type of country we do have today. So, a very key element of that was the creation of what Pat mentioned was the Special Infantry Corps. This was a unit of 4,000 people in the Irish National Army whose primary purpose was to break strikes, to intimidate any working people. And you have some examples in Waterford. Do we have it there? 600-700 sent into Waterford to break strikes. So the Special Infantry Corps is a unit in the Irish Army, particularly directed to attacking social struggles. And even one pro-treaty Sinn Féin TD, who has witnessed how the Special Infantry Corps has taken land back from farmers in Cork, he said, "But why are we doing this? These people gave us assistance when we were out in the hills fighting against an alien government. I think it is very bad action for the government to seize cattle on these farms for arrears of rent due to English landlords." So we're reimposing order at the end of the Civil War. And you can look there at some of the measures that begin to be taken by the Free State government. The abolition of the Republican courts, the return to the normal British-style courts. One of the key features of Irish politics to this day is the complete central control over local authorities. Local authorities in Ireland have very little say. Why? Because the Free State government, terrified by the attempt to allow local authorities to break away from central government, it imposes this very tight central control on local governments which exist to this day. The emphasis on balanced budgets, the Land Enforcement Act, all sorts of measures are taken really to establish the type of state we have today. And if we look at what that means in practice, you can see it from the famous statements made by the people at the time. By the way, this quotation here from Patrick McGilligan, the Ministry for Industry and Commerce, this quote was put up on Fianna Fáil posters as they tried to take power in the 30s. Fianna Fáil were a radical party at one stage. And the McGilligan is saying it is not the function of the Dáil to provide work, and the sooner this is realised, the better. People may have to die in this country of starvation. In other words, the state has no obligation to provide work. The state has no obligation to provide a right to housing, a right to work, any of the social rights. The Irish state is making clear it's having nothing to do with that. Okay, and then so therefore you ask, okay, we've been through a revolutionary process, we have a civil war, it's becoming quite clear that the new state is going to impose by force, and to some extent by terror, on the population a return to the existing order. How are people going to accept that? And what I want to argue in the last slide is that the compensation was Catholic fundamentalism. That even if you didn't change your life, you could be proud that you were living in the most Catholic of countries in the world. And we sometimes think that the moves to, the banning of contraception, divorce and so on, it began with De Valera and Fianna Fáil. Not true. The actual moves to creating church power in Ireland began under the Common Gael government. And it began really, I would argue, as a spiritual antidepressant. You know, you got nothing from the revolution, but at least you got the most Catholic country in the world. And what was the most Catholic country in the world? Well, you know the story, the Committee on Evil Literature, the Magdalen Laundries, and so on and so on. So in many ways, why Ireland was such a Catholic country, I would argue, is an aspect of a failed revolution for the reasons I've outlined. And it's only now, I think, we're beginning to undo some of the results of all that. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Kieran, for that talk. It was very interesting and enlightening, to be honest. If you have any questions for Kieran, he'll take questions now, and then we're going to have all three speakers up, I think, together to take questions. Thanks very much.
Kieran, you mentioned how, I suppose, the workers of the time, you know, were pushed back, a counter-revolution and all of that, which is, I think, fundamentally true. And you roll forward to today, and you now look, say, at the present Dáil, and you see, say, the leader of Sinn Féin, Mary Lou MacDonald, I would imagine quite a well-heeled and I understand well-educated woman, that wouldn't strike me as somebody that would have a natural affinity with what I would call working-class people. Do you see comparisons or parallels between how the Dáil and how what might be considered the leading political force in the country at the moment, because polls and everything else would nearly suggest that under Mary Lou MacDonald that Sinn Féin are probably going to, you know, dominate the next parliament or whatever. And are we being, I don't know, led into a position where regular working people are putting perhaps false hope, if I can put it that way, in someone like MacDonald and the Sinn Féin group, rather than the more left-wing socialist groupings that might exist in the Dáil? And if parliamentary politics is even the way to go forward anyway, that maybe there's a different type of struggle need to take place, or have we lost the plot completely? I hope you can understand what I'm trying to say.
I understand you absolutely, Joe. And, you know, I have to declare an interest here. I would be a supporter of one of those radical left-wing groups, the Dáil. So obviously, I'm going to say yes to your question. But look, maybe the other way of taking it is to, I mean, what's interesting in Irish history, I mean, let's just go to the Fianna Fáil party, right? So people look at the Fianna Fáil party today, and was it a third of members don't know, only a third of members know what they stand for. What did Fianna Fáil stand for in the 1920s? Fianna Fáil were far more radical than Sinn Féin are today. To give an example, De Valera was asked, who of the leaders of 1916 do you most want to follow? James Connolly. Fianna Fáil were for the abolition of a standing army. They thought having a standing army in a barracks is a product of empire. So Fianna Fáil's position was abolish the army. Fianna Fáil wanted to abolish banks. Like, well, not just we regulate them, they wanted to abolish banks because they thought banks were robbing Ireland, and you wanted a system of credit unions where people put their money in relatively small amounts. That was their argument. Now, at the end, it didn't happen like that. So I think there is a lesson in history generally that nationalist movements often talk very radical. So you mentioned Mary Lou, but you could also mention Robert Mugabe or Yasser Arafat or Nelson Mandela. But then when they come into power or come near power, it is a different story. I mean, I think that is a feature of history generally. Now, we can debate in political strategy what you do about that, but I would think that there is important. It's important to be aware of this history, isn't it? Because it can happen again. Yeah, definitely.
Kieran, brilliant alternative view, for want of a better word, of the revolution. But you mentioned the parallel struggle, if you like, for the land. But that seems to have been, would I be right in saying that was confined to certain areas?
West of Ireland, man.
Particularly the West.
Yeah.
And a thing that surprised me, and probably I need to look into it further, Waterford had one of the lowest transfers of land in the state. 56% of the land was transferred under the various land acts, compared to 70 plus, 80% plus in some areas. Yet, I never came across any, if you like, the land hunger or something like that. And during the Great Strike, they were very careful to emphasise, we're not looking for the land. All we want is a living wage. But why was it confined to the West?
I don't know. It's a good question. I just don't know the answer to that. But you're right, that is what happened. I mean, so if you want to just be schematic about it, if we talk about two elements of the land struggle, one is, we want the land. That is mainly confined to the West. And the one that you dealt with there, landless labourers. I think you said in your talk that that Waterford had a higher proportion of land, it had the highest proportion of landless labourers in Munster, and I presume Munster was dairy farming and bigger farming and so on, whereas in the West there was much more poorer farmers, and I think there was a big struggle there. But I don't know why there wasn't a struggle for the land as much here. I just don't know the answer to that.
You talked about Connolly having a sort of narrow vision based on syndicalism and not looking at maybe the bigger picture. The other view that's given of him is that he had an interest in a whole lot of other things, like the Irish language and a whole lot of other social actions that should have been taken, and it's been suggested that he kind of anticipated Antonio Gramsci. Is that your view, or do you just think he was very syndicalist and the other stuff was maybe the kind of nationalist stuff that people have said he was really a nationalist?
To be honest, I skipped over the Connolly thing because it's such a big debate, right? But I think it'd be unfair to say that Connolly was just a syndicalist, right? So what Connolly does, I mean, just in brief terms, Connolly becomes a left-winger in Edinburgh, joins a very small socialist group, which he finds ultimately is a bit of a sect, is isolated from people, and then in a very healthy response goes to America and becomes part of the industrial workers of the world. And their whole attitude is, let's have one big union, let's have a general strike to lock out the capitalist class. That was their model. And then that's how you bring about change. So in that sense, he's a syndicalist. But then in his later life, he takes part in the 1916 rebellion, partly the action of a syndicalist, and he does get involved in a very small political party, the Independent Labour Party, I think, in Ireland, which, by the way, splits in 1914 over whether he should back the war or not. So it's not that he doesn't take, if you like, the wider picture seriously, but he doesn't. The main point is he didn't succeed in building anything, right? And what he leaves behind afterwards is the Irish Citizen Army. And I remember when I first came to Dublin, I went up to the one survivor of the Irish Citizen Army, a man called Frank Robbins, who wrote a book on the Irish Citizen Army. I said to Frank, he was an older man at the time, says, well, what did you do? The Irish Citizen Army and so on. He says, the main thing we did was just drilling. We used to go up in Fairview Park, up and down, with our hurley sticks, drilling and so on. They didn't really see themselves as a political force. So therefore, by 1918, you've really only got the Socialist Party of Ireland, run by these two trade union leaders, who, they sort of say we support the Russian Revolution, but really they're not interested. And therefore, there is nothing really. I mean, there's a tiny communist party formed eventually by Roddy Connolly, and he does try, Roddy Connolly, Connolly's son, does try to influence some of the anti-treatyites to take up the social struggle, but he doesn't get a hearing for that. So that there's really no left, organised left in Ireland at the time. Yeah.
Can we get the other speakers to come down to the front, or are you happy with that? Take questions if there are any other questions. I think Keith recording back wants people to.
All right.
So that it can be recorded. If you have any questions for any of the speakers,
Can I start it off, John? Again, thanks to Kieran and Trace and, of course, Pat for three excellent presentations. And now, just trying to bring I suppose, a thread through all three from what I've seen of it, and bring it into sort of the modern day and modern day politics. And I mentioned it briefly when I addressed the question to Kieran earlier on.
Therese dealt with women and the role of women perhaps in the struggle, both in the revolutionary period and indeed, maybe through the labour classes and so on. And we're now in 2021, and that type of struggle mostly seems to have been gone, the military side of things anyway. And the battleground seems to be in Dáil Éireann and Shannon Éireann and places like that. So in terms of Theresa's element, we constantly hear that women are underrepresented in politics. Women are underrepresented in the Dáil, and probably underrepresented in all sorts of things like that. And yet we look at the Dáil perhaps as this place that runs the country, and that everything that happens goes in or out of that place. And I'm just wondering what the panel's general view is of the Dáil playing that role, and is that the correct type of model that we should have in Ireland, or is there a vision of an alternative model? And then secondly, in terms of the women, I'd like to know, Therese, if you subscribe to that view that there should be more women parliamentarians, politicians and so on, or is that just another divisive type of thing, that the real struggle is for ordinary people and workers and everybody else to sort of get a fair crack at the whip, irrespective of who's given them the opportunity, that it doesn't have to be exclusively men running things or exclusively women, but that once it's the right people doing it, wherever they come from, then we kind of get to not quite a Valhalla situation, but as good as we're going to get kind of a situation. Now, it's a long-winded way of putting it, but I'm trying to string the three elements between worker struggle, women's struggle, revolutionary struggle, and indeed just labour struggles all through history. We never, in my view, seem to progress very far. I could be wrong, that's just how it looks to me. I'm just thinking how you might think of that, and how, I mean, we started this, I thought at the start, with almost women being written out of history, and hence the opening night was Theresa on women. I don't know if they've made any significant progress since. So it's wide enough, but there you go.
I mean,
There are mic.
can I just speak with that the mic?
Yeah,
Or
Yeah, please use it. Yeah.
speak with the mic? Is it on? Or?
Mic's on.
Yeah. I think there should be more women, obviously, in any kind of situation, and the kind of the words that they put the motion in 1921. That it's a sign of the progress of society, and if women are given space and can be heard, and are visible, and if you look, I mean, that sentiment goes back to Charles Fourier in the 1830s, when they kind of invented socialism. I mean, he kind of just said that the sign of progress in a society is when there are women there, and James Connolly sort of endorsed the same idea with his writings about women. But I think if you just want to have women there, that's just the important bit, then just go and have, what do you call it, set numbers of women can be elected on a party ticket. I mean, I just think all the other ways, you just go round the mulberry bush, and the one thing that does work is if you have a set number of people being represented and going forward. It worked in the early 20th century when women came through the trade union movement, for that moment that we looked at on Friday. And I think I was just kind of thinking when Kieran was speaking about the revival, if you like, of the Women Workers' Union and the women-only union, which was always frowned upon very deeply, really, in the trade union movement, and the way it had developed was obviously quite often seen as a very conservative movement. Well, it was only as conservative as the people at the times that were in it, in a sense. It could have been a more radical organisation, but I kind of feel that the women that kind of decided that the women workers had to survive and went at all costs to do that, in a sense was partly because they wanted the legacy of James Connolly's ideas to be part of the revolution, and they had sort of struggled to bring that into Sinn Féin, the League of Women Deputies, when they kind of had the organisation in 1917. And I think they saw the trade union movement as a place that could still hold that argument. I mean, if we remember 1917, Helena Maloney, Bridget Davis, Rosie Hackett went up Liberty Hall and put up the banner that said James Connolly executed, you know, and commemorated his first anniversary, because literally nobody else was doing anything about it. The trade union movement and nobody. So they barricaded themselves in, and the army tried to get them down, and they put coal against the door. It's a kind of extraordinary story, but so there's that element. And somehow I think, I don't know why or what the circumstances are, but they had sussed that this was going to be, if you like, the first casualty of the revolution. Connolly's kind of ideas, if you like, the socialism was actually going to be written out. And I kind of still hark back to the thing that I mentioned on Friday night, the fact that Una Pope Hennessy, in her diary, sort of had noticed in 1917 that one of the most determined efforts that De Valera was making was to remove Connolly from the kind of sense of where Ireland's struggle would be heading. Don't know if that really addresses what you raised, but anyway.
It does, certainly, to a point anyway. It's like, but there's probably no end to it, really. It's like history, it's always evolving, I suppose.
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead, Pat.
Yeah. Is this working okay?
Well, he said to you beforehand to use it, but it doesn't seem to be
Doesn't
working.
seem to be.
Right, on that. I'd like to develop a little a thing that Kieran so rightly emphasised. The lack of power of local authorities. Everything is centralised in Dublin. But I'd take it a bit further than you, Joe. I would say the Dáil is virtually powerless. It's a talking shop. A motion gets passed in the Dáil. It has no status, it has no standing. If the opposition in their private members' time pass a motion saying that the local authority or the local property tax should be doubled or whatever, that has no significance. The government are free to ignore it, to dismiss it as the mad ramblings of the opposition. Sure, what else would they do? So it's become even more centralised. It is purely in the hands of the executive and the cabinet. Incredible centralisation of power. So, kind of, if the Dáil didn't sit for the next 6 months, would anybody actually miss it in terms of the running of the country? It's an appalling thing to say that the primary democratically elected forum is treated at times with disdain by the cabinet and the government. And I don't know, here you'd agree with that rant.
Well, sorry, just working.
There don't seem to be any more.
Yeah, okay, look, yeah, I mean, you got to be a little bit careful, because obviously sometimes the alternative to Dáil might be bloody Mussolini arriving in, so we're not going that way, right? But just, it is important that people are aware of the limitations of the Dáil. So, I mean, I work with the people for profit deputies, and I go in there once a week, but I was shocked to discover, I didn't know this until 2 years ago, that if you're a member of the opposition and you put forward a bill that has any financial implications, it's just ruled out of order. And the point is that 46 bills in the last Dáil are ruled out of order because even if you get a majority for them, you can't even discuss them, because under the financial measure, an opposition is not allowed to put forward any proposal which is financial costs on the state. Now, that's bad enough, but they then extend that into all sorts of other areas where it's a bit vague. So you might say, for example, we want to ban fracking in Ireland. Is that a cost on the state or not? But they will use this measure to say that you can't put forward such a bill. So there is a problem in terms of the Dáil, right? There's also a problem in terms of people obviously telling you lies at election, then going in voting differently. Can you recall them? There's all sorts of... So I am for, if you like, extending the level of democracy in Ireland, and it's a long discussion, but I think we shouldn't assume that democracy is a finished product and now we have it all. We should look at other ways of extending it. Having said that, I think it's important that people have representation in the Dáil, because if nothing else, you're going to see this person on your 6 o'clock news articulating things that people feel on the ground. So it's very important to have people in the Dáil, whatever people's political views are. Just quickly on the question of women, I think that absolutely I agree with Teresa. First of all, there's complete underrepresentation of women in Irish politics to do with its history. But what we have is essentially an elite who have moved to what I would call to a skin-deep liberalism. So if you think of Leo Varadkar, he was originally against the marriage equality. He spoke in the Dáil against marriage equality, and then he shifts. And so you have this shift amongst the elite. But what that means in practice is 40% of your candidates in the election have to be women. There is funding for women candidates. All of this is happening, right? But it doesn't address some fundamental issues affecting women's equality. So two in particular, we have the highest creche fees in Europe. You know, incredible. I mean, think of how much it costs to send a kid to a creche in Ireland. Or, I just saw it recently, remember Simon Harris said he was going to provide free contraception. He said that at 2000, and he was going to have to provide free contraception by 2021. Nothing happening. This week, France has just provided free contraception for 25 million for a population that is, 10 times the size of Ireland, but yet we can't do it in Ireland. In other words, they do a lot of tokenism and minor detail. They don't address fundamental issues of equality, I don't think.
I would certainly agree with the idea that there's an awful lot of tokenism. And the classic example is the Cúpla Focal. What they'll do, pay a token thing to the Irish language, but don't do anything that might be real. And that classic tokenism was always the politician starting off with a Cúpla Focal Oscuelga, and then he'd say, now for the benefit of those in present who are not fluent in our national language, I will continue in English. You know, pure tokenism. Was that, sorry?
Yeah, it was just with regard to the issue of the sort of democratic deficit. I think sometime in the 1920s, the Department of Local Government suggested to the government that they should abolish all local authorities. Shouldn't have any of them at all. They were unnecessary. And then in 1929, they established the city managers, the city manager in Cork, 1929. And the city manager, county manager, is surely unique. I've often wondered, like governors in the US or mayors in the US, I think they've got less power than a city manager. The city manager is effectively the corporate chief executive of the local area. The councils, good luck to them, and it's a great forum and so forth, but the city manager controls Ireland.
Well,
just to give an example, just a Dublin example, just to really illustrate this. When I get up in the morning, I look out at the sky and there's an incinerator spewing out smoke for 24 hours a day. I think 42 of the 45 councillors voted against having an incinerator. The city manager decided he wants one. That's why you have an incinerator. So they have enormous powers. And not just the mayor. In America, their mayor is elected. This is an unelected person who can override elected representatives. I mean, it's extraordinary, the clamp on democracy, local democracy here.
See, what central government did in various things, when they recognised that something might be controversial, you give the power to the city manager, which is why the city manager in Dublin, I think something like 5 or 6 times, the vast majority of the Dublin City Councils voted against the incinerator. And no, city manager decided to go ahead. The same way, and I said, living in Sandymount, I'm very conscious of it, the recent thing about the cycling proposal. And, you know, let's put it this way. The Strand Road in Sandymount, and I live very near it, has over the years become a perfect bypass. It has bypassed Sandymount village, and it has helped to preserve the village nature of Sandymount, which is fantastic. But now, Owen Keegan says, to facilitate the cyclists, and I'm all for providing But he picked one option. There were plenty of other better options in my view. And he said, well, the diverted traffic can go in through the village. He decides that. Councillors are against it. Doesn't matter. He decides. It's a total, as you said perfectly, the democratic deficit. And it's there by giving this power to the unelected.
I was not aware of that until this very moment, that is how it runs here, that the city manager has that much control. I can't believe that, and why aren't we doing something immediately to change that? That's shocking.
Well, I think that, yeah. All right, Tom, go ahead.
In the absence of organised labour's contribution to the struggle during that period, would the outcome have been the same in terms of a British withdrawal in the 26 counties?
I think you're correct. I think the involvement of the Labour movement was quite decisive in terms of the anti-conscription strike, the inability to move munitions, and the general mass, if you like, boycott of the RIC stations. I think if it had been a purely IRA struggle, they mightn't have even got rid of the British, or ended up with even less than they got at the moment. So in that aspect, I mean, obviously certain things were gained in terms of the War of Independence, but often the credit is not given to Labour for playing its role in that.
I'm certain the mics are working. I think they are. I'll ask you to use them if you could, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're, just so everybody knows, we're recording this for posterity, and the mics are helping to get it onto the soundtrack to back up the pictures that we're filming. So in 50 years' time, when somebody looks back on this, I want them to hear what your answers are. So,
Can I make a comment on that?
Yeah.
If the Labour movement had played a more prominent role, if they had allied themselves, we say, Sinn Féin, and had agreed a certain degree of representation, would we have had possibly a slightly different treaty delegation? Look at the treaty delegation. You know, I don't think any of them, you know, could in any way be described as anything approaching socialist, even with the smallest S that you could find. You know, ranging from Arthur Griffith, Michael Collins, Eamon Duggan, Gavin Duffy, Robert Barton. It was an incredibly conservative delegation focused on one thing only, the constitutional relationship between Ireland and Britain. You know, I think that Labour missed an opportunity in not pushing their involvement further in the revolution. But that's just, say, a personal opinion.
I also kind of feel that one of the problems that Labour faced was the, if you like, its kind of emergence as something that came out of both the South and the North, to use sort of very unwieldy phrases of the geography of the country and the politics of the country. That the trade union movement saw itself very much in terms of its All Ireland. Today it's still quite proud that only the Irish Rugby and the Irish Congress of Trade Unions are the two sort of All Ireland bodies that have survived the whole of the partition and the evolution of the separation. And it spent quite a lot of time, I think, looking over its shoulder. I mean, to some extent, by 1914, I mean, a lot of kind of the Belfast unions had decided to sort of, you know, pick up their skirts and not bother coming back. But there was always that possibility that they would, and what Congress would have wanted that to happen. And I think that was something that probably, I'm not saying paralysed them, but certainly kind of weakened probably a lot of their thinking at the time, or, you know, not weakened their thinking, but weakened their resolve as to coming down on one way or the other. I think also Sinn Féin had shown itself very resistant to having any other kind of powerful sort of movement kind of making any concessions really to to Labour, or to, you know, certainly I think they saw both Labour and women as potential difficult areas, and were fairly determined to keep them out of the scene.
Johnny. Go on, Johnny.
Yeah, my question is essentially, what is to be done? I mean, there was wonderful talks this weekend, and the heroism of ordinary people, you know, in terms of trying to change Ireland, has been kind of highlighted brilliantly. Women, workers, and all this, and the mass movements of people. But the parliament that we got hasn't changed the class nature or structure of society on the basis, you know, and the limited powers even that our elected representatives have. It looks to me as if real power doesn't lie in Parliament at all. It lies in the boardrooms of the big companies, and the politicians and the main parties represent their class interests. And given that, you know, you look at the housing crisis, you look at the health crisis, you look at the climatic change, all this sort of stuff, you look at these vulture funds taking over in terms of house building and renting and all the problems that we face. And one of the speakers from the floor mentioned the role of Sinn Féin. It seems to me that if you look at what Sinn Féin are doing when they're in power in the north, they're not going to really make profound and fundamental changes, it seems to me, because they're not challenging the class nature of the type of society that obviously exists. So what do people do, and especially given the role of the leadership of the official leadership of the Labour movement? I'm talking about Congress and what used to be the Labour Party. So what is to be done, essentially, is the question.
Well, I mean, it's obviously a famous title, but what do I think? What should Labour movements be doing in the next short, rather than thinking long term? I mean, first of all, the housing crisis. I mean, it is quite shocking. I'm sure it's the same in Waterford as other parts of the country, but the document housing fraud is not going to solve the housing crisis. Rents are going to remain very high. I think most young people will either think of emigrating or staying in their parents' house in their late 20s because they won't be able to afford rent. So we have a huge housing crisis here. So I think it's a major issue that people should be mobilising on, just as we mobilise on the water charges. The problem again is there was supposed to be a major march on 2nd of October under Raise the Roof. The Irish Commerce Trade Unions has just pulled out of it. So I don't know how we're going to get a focus on it, but it seems to me that is a major issue in Irish society. And the other one I just want to highlight is the climate. There will be obviously people's attention is focusing on what's happening on climate at the moment because of all the scenes on our television. There will be a COP conference in Glasgow in November that will really bring it to attention. And I think that often, I mean, what worries me is that people will associate the climate movement with the Green Party and think it's about making ordinary people sacrifice, paying more for your petrol and this, that and the other. And I just think the Labour movement needs to develop a genuine just transition approach, which is about not penalising people, but making it easier to for example, get out of cars. I mean, we have the worst public transport system in Europe. Dublin has the dearest fares in Europe. I have to use Dublin examples. So if you had a decent public transport system and you're guaranteed you can get on a bus and it's going to take you to your workplace, of course people would get out of cars. But the approach is just blame the individual. So I think we need to develop a different agenda on climate, particularly with the Greens in power. That's what I would see as some of the tasks at the moment.
Well, I think that to dwell on the housing crisis for a moment, just think for, you know, and this is simplistic. There's no harm being simplistic occasionally. In the 1930s and again in the 1950s, Ireland was a very poor country, and we built some of the best housing, public housing. Now we're among the richest countries in the world and we can't build houses.
Yeah.
And until the state actually takes ownership and says, we, the state, will deliver, we will use the local authorities, and we will build. But instead of this semi-liberal, skin-deep liberalism oh, the private sector, etc., 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 until they grasp it. But I have to say, Kieran, I thought when you were talking about the counter-reaction, that wonderful phrase, the triumph of the Clongowes Wood boys, on that. And
They're still there.
yeah,
Still there?
now, I was brought up at a time when we thought that the Irish Rebellion, as it was called at the time, then the Irish Revolution, was the product of the Christian Brother boys. And being one myself, I said, great. Now I see, geez, we were beaten by Clongowes Wood. And I think that actually sums up a lot, the entrenched power. And if you actually look not at the current government, but go back to the previous government, I think for about the first time ever, a majority of the cabinet had been educated in private schools.
Correct. Yeah.
You know, that's the triumph of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the Irish politicians originally had a sort of usually man of the people style stuff. You know, they went to the same schools, supported the same GA. What's beginning to emerge is a bit like the British pattern, where if you look at a Tory cabinet, I mean, more than half of them have gone to a private school.
Yeah.
That is beginning to emerge in Ireland now. So you're absolutely right. The last cabinet was the first one that had a majority of ministers that went to a private school. I haven't checked out this one, but I'm sure it's going that way as well.
I'm not going to defer from either of the speakers on what is to be done question. I mean, it seems to me that that's the issues that would be mentioned are the vital ones, but it's the both of the issues of we can see that we've governments that are not really prepared to sort of act on it. You know, we can keep separating our rubbish till the fires take over or the floods come. I mean, it's you know, you just need something much stronger, and maybe we don't demand enough from our governments, but I think we do have to think about different ways of doing things, and in terms of how we kind of mobilise. You know, we do tend to fall back on the 19th century kind of movements of marching or protesting in that way, and I think, you know, some of the kind of community developments, I think the Labour movement should be much more kind of tied with its communities. I know it sounds a ridiculous thing to say to a Trades Council meeting, at a meeting of people sponsored by the Trades Council, because obviously the essence of a Trades Council is that it is that. But I don't think there's really enough on a sort of general issue. It's probably very strong in certain places, but it's not as strong as a sort of national movement, and that seems to me that we need to kind of reconsider some of these kind of ways of operating. And I mean, everybody knows, just even on the technology, the changeover to you know, people being in touch with each other in new ways rather than me waiting on the letter. You know, there's a ping goes off on a machine somewhere in the room, and you know, that kind of sense. It's kind of having to rethink, and sometimes we have to rethink by going backwards and looking backwards and seeing kind of actually how did they do things. You know, certain forms may have carried on, but actually sometimes what they did in the past were things that we can learn today. And the thing that always sticks in my mind is when women looked for reserved seats on the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, and people were outraged. I mean, many trade unionists were furious and said that this had absolutely nothing to do with trade union democracy, and would be, you know, a complete sort of deviation. And then, when I go and look at the kind of history of trade unions, we discover the INTO did it in 1907. You know, it's that kind of, you know, the battle that it took from kind of, you know, over a decade and a bit to try and sort of get representation for women in the movement was you know, could have almost been shortchanged if we knew our history better.
I just discovered, was it the number of councillors in Waterford? 30?
32.
There's 32 councillors in Waterford, and as far as I could be wrong, it's 2 or 3 are women.
Sorry?
There's 2 or 3 out of 32 in Waterford today that are women. Right. So clearly there's a really serious problem today.
Yeah. I mean, people have often said things like, why women need trade unions, and sometimes we need to say why trade unions need women. Just kind of try and turn it upside down and look at it another angle.
But I know we're coming towards the end, but you're just saying the same thing, Therese, about why trade unions need women. If you go all the way back to the start of the talks and even through the labour history, whatever roles women take, they seem to be pushed to the back. You know, you mentioned Rosie Hackett, we know about Countess Markovich, you mentioned her as well, but there's not too many standout women when you think about it. There had to be loads of them, there had to be, but they're just brushed out.
I've been very lucky.
Or else I'm just misreading this whole thing.
I've just learned that the Miss McCarthy I know nothing about, I now have met kind of one of her relations, and I can kind of pick her up and go on a bit more forward with those stories. Because these are, I mean, I do think that people do need to be sort of rescued from the sort of, not even the footnotes, but from the silences and the absences and the sort of, because in the end, those are vacuums, there's no air in that space if you don't kind of really fill it with some of the kind of peoples and struggles of
If we're all done, I'd like to thank our three speakers. It's been very interesting, informative and enlightening at times, and I think there's much to reflect on. So I'd like to say thanks to Therese, to Pat and to Kieran, and thanks to you all for coming down as well and supporting the event. Thanks.
Thank you.